Yugioh here, and welcome to the last video I'll be making of the decade. This has been an amazing year. I've got to say sorry though for the past week. I have been unable to upload because of my internet was really bad. Said it on my Facebook page before I'd say it here. But this is the last video of the decade. A decade of Yugioh. I have been playing this game since it was first released, but I really got competitive this decade and I became good at the game. I've been making videos constantly for about 4 years, I think, or maybe 5, but we're at the end of a decade of Yugioh, and at the end of the decade, I've got to say 2 things. 1, Happy New Year to you all. It's good to know that this year I was able to reach 952 subscribers. I'm very happy to know that I was able to reach that this year. Wasn't able to reach 1,000 before the end of the year, but hopefully in the new decade I'll reach 1,000 and I will start getting more and more viewers and subscribers, being able to make better content and all of the likes. But yeah, thank you all so much for that. Happy New Year's to all of you as well. But I can also say, in this decade, we have had a lot of decks. And this video is talking about the 10 best decks, in my opinion, of this decade. Now, this is going to be for various reasons, whether how long they lasted, whether how long in the current decade they were able to last, how if they came back, if they didn't come back, if they were tier 0. It's going to be multiple different things for this deck, for these decks, and some I don't know a lot about. I'm going to be honest. I don't know everything about these decks. I only know things that I've been told and things that I've seen, but a lot of these decks I do know, I do hate, I can admit. But I cannot disagree with these being the best decks of the decade. So let's get into the video. Happy New Year to all of you before this video starts. Please, before the end of the decade, if you're watching this, maybe like, comment, and subscribe to the video already, just to show that it's the end of the decade. You're going to have a Happy New Year as well. But without further ado, let's get into the video. So, first deck on this list is a deck that was tier 0 at the beginning of the decade, and that was Infinities. Now, Infinities are one of the best decks in this game, in this decade, for a few reasons. 1, this deck consistently performed all the way up to Firewall. It came on and off it came on and off in different eras, had multiple different things, and at the beginning of the decade, it was a tier 0 deck. It was able to set up some of the most busted boards in the game during the beginning of this decade, being that it was just tier 0. It was able to set up multiple Infinity barriers and other things along those lines. It was able to combo heavily. It was very consistent, and all you needed to do to combo off was get rid of your hand. Now, the deck also had other good things in this decade as well. It had the Synchro build, which set up multiple different Synchro advantages. It was a deck in the Xyz era as well, using cards like Lavarval Chain and Augusta Emerald and all cards like that. The deck even came back for a last shot, I believe, with Firewall Dragon, getting a Firewall Loop, which I believe was an FTK, not an FTK build, sorry. No, it was an FTK build. There was an FTK build around it, and this deck was able to bounce back a lot in this era, in this decade, and it was consistently played by a lot of players. It was something that always kind of reared its head, so it's definitely a deck that is one of the best decks of this decade, and it's just what I personally think. Like, there's no way I can say this decade was, like, this deck was just good in the decade. That's all I can really say about it. I don't really know a lot about the deck, personally, but from what I've been told, from what I've seen, I can definitely agree Infinity is pretty much one of the best decks in the decade. Now, this list is set out by when the deck was released, or when the deck was really popular, so it is a little different from what your list would be. It's not like a top 10, it's more of like just order of when they were good, but this deck is on this list, and it's here. But the next deck we're going to be talking about is Merlin. In this decade, this deck has reared its head multiple times, being an OTK strategy, being just a really good deck in general, and also it was one of the best decks in the game at one point, standing next to Fire Fists. And the reason this deck is on this list over Fire Fists, in my opinion, is because, yes, this deck could lose to Fire Fist, it could win against Fire Fist, but this deck came back. This deck came back into the meta. when Atlantean Prince came out, this deck always had a presence in the meta. There was always someone playing Mermail. There was always someone there being able to top with Mermail. Someone who could play it, someone who could OTK your opponent, hand loop them for a few cards with like Moon and Glacier. There was always this deck running around, even in the Synchro era. Well, no, sorry, when Synchros became good, in Pendulum era. Like, there was so many times I saw this deck do well, and I just can't not say it's good. And especially when the deck got Atlantean Prince. Like, the deck became so relevant when it got Atlantean Prince that it was just insane. Like, Atlantean Prince made the deck even better than it was, and made OTKing like, oh, I opened this one Prince, you're dead, you lose. So definitely, this deck is one of the best decks of the decade. It came back. It was good. It was super powerful when it was originally released. It still holds some presence in the game. I played this deck. I still lose to it. It's a deck that is one of the best decks of the decade, and I'm not going to disagree with that because it is one of the best decks of the decade. So, Mermail, it was released in this order. It was released after Infinities, so it's on here now. Next is a deck if you played this format, you were not fun, you were not happy with yourself. If you saw this deck, you were like, ugh, unless you're playing spellbooks, and that is Dragon Rulers. Dragon Rulers was one of the most busted decks in the game for a few reasons. One, at the time, it was the most easiest deck to use, being able to control the game easy. It was a tier 0 deck, by the way. Being able to just summon multiple dragons, OTK your opponent, use Super Rejuvenation to add multiple cards, draw multiple cards at the end of your turn, use cards like Sixth Sense to mill your deck out to get more dragons in the graveyard, having access to cards like Red MD. This deck was literally one of the best decks in the game, and is still a deck that is favored to play in past format Yu-Gi-Oh! And that is insane. How a deck like this lost every Dragon Ruler it possibly had. Like, literally, Tempest, Tidal, and Redox are still... No, sorry, not Tempest. Blaster, Tempest... Blaster, Tidal, and Redox are still banned. These cards are still banned. The only one the only one legal in the current game is Tempest. That's it. And the rest are banned. Mainly because, like, they had a deck for a week that was insane. After they were all limited to one, the babies were banned, so the deck was weak. And it came back. The Dragon Rulers came back with a fury when Dark Matter Dragon was released, and the deck just the Dragon Rulers just couldn't exist. So this deck was a tier 0 deck in the game. It was a deck that literally instilled fear to everybody. It came back for a week, like proper Dragon Rulers came back for a week just with Dark Matter Dragon, and the deck instantly died. Like, this is definitely one of the best decks in the game, in the decade, and that's why it's on this list, because it's definitely one of the decks that will always be memorable from this decade. So, yeah. Next, we have one that a lot of people played, Burning Abyss. Burning Abyss is definitely one of the best decks in this decade. Being one of the big DUA free, with Tellarknights, well, maybe Big 4, but I think it's the Big 3, with Tellarknights, Shadows, and Burning Abyss. Sure, Shadows was the best deck at the time of its release, but Burning Abyss, they could compete with Shadows, they could compete constantly in the format, and they kept coming back stronger and stronger and stronger. Burning Abyss have constantly seen play throughout the 5 years that they've been released. They've seen play in Sekka builds. They've seen play in Phantom Knight builds. They've seen play in Rank 3 Turbo. This deck has not died. The deck has one Seer and one Graph, and the deck didn't die. The deck got Beatrice limited to 1. The deck didn't die. The deck has 3 Dante. The deck just is a deck that's never died. And this is clearly one of the best decks in the game, if even one of the most busted decks in the game, being that it's just something that could free summon constantly. It has access to trap cards like Fire Lake of the Burning Abyss, being able to pop 2 of your Burning Abyss monsters, gain their effects, and kill 3 cards your opponent controls. It was able to use a Hydra Lander. Most recently, in pure monster build with Light of Sekka, it's able to use with Phantom Knights, playing multiple consistency cards like Fogblade and other cards like that to consistently get into Dante, mill more cards, use your Burning Abyss cards. It got Beatrice, which made the deck even better. Like, throughout the years, this deck has never died. This deck has always been a powerhouse in the game, and I don't think it will ever die to this day, because the deck is just still constantly being powerful. So, Burning Abyss is definitely one of the best decks of this decade. It's the only one out of the 3 decks that was able to survive entering the Link era, was able to survive in so many other formats. And I just can't honestly say that this deck is not the best deck out of the big 3 nowadays. Because literally, it's the only one that was able to survive. Sure, Shadows, they had Winder, but they weren't able to survive because they lost Construct. They only had Shadow Fusion and El Shadow Fusion. Like, the deck was not able to survive. Burning Abyss lost some of their good cards, but they were still able to survive. Tellarknights, they're good. They were good. They've always been somewhat decent, but they weren't able to survive through the Link era. They weren't able to continuously play on after that. So it's like, this deck is definitely the best out of the big 3, and is definitely one of the best decks of the decade. I'm sorry, I can't not say that. But yeah, next, a deck that only had 2 weeks in play, and there's still a video on this channel with me being pissed as soon as it got hit, and that is Pepe. Pepe being the deck that could set up all your Solemn Strikes turn 1, being a deck that could end on Infinity, Rafflesia, with a Pendulum Summon for free, have consistency cards and more cards for the following turn. A deck that was absolutely insane, that it got hit within a week, and within 2 weeks. Pepe was one of the best decks in the game. They hit everything for that deck. They hit Ptolemaeus. They hit Monkey Ball to 1. They hit Joker to 1. They hit, I believe they banned Damage Juggler. They banned Plushfire. They literally killed that deck within 2 weeks on an emergency ban list. And that being said, that deck, it would still be scary today if that deck was fully legal in Yu-Gi-Oh! So I can't not say that it's the best deck, one of the best decks in the game. Definitely one of the best decks in the decade. And guys, honestly, 2 weeks. This deck only had 2 weeks. So yeah, Pepe, you will always be a deck that is scary, and that's just a fact. So yeah. Next though, the true Dracos. And this is the one we hate, the one with Masterpiece. Being the best Floodgate deck ever to exist, being given to us in Yu-Gi-Oh! When a deck such as Zodiac was in the game, this deck was scary. This deck was not fine. This deck was not okay. And I think I've got this in the wrong order, but it's fine because I just realized it. But True Draco. When this deck came out, we were scared. Masterpiece being a monster that you could tribute. You could tribute to a monster and a spell, or a monster and a trap, or a trap and a spell, so you can't do anything to it. Banish a True Draco card from the graveyard and pop an opponent's card for free during either player's turn. Having access to every floodgate in the game, like Rivalry of the Warlords, Gozen Match, Skill Drain, like Monarchs Erupt. Everything this deck had was fear. This was fear. Fear itself. And when this deck came out, it was insane. Now, the only deck that I can compare this to that would have been better than it, but was a deck that I cannot justifiably say was a good deck in this decade, is Monarchs. And this was scarier to me than Monarchs. This deck could play the Monarch's Domain and deal with your opponent at the same time. You could play around Monarchs in this game, but you couldn't play around a True Draco player. If they went first, they set up a Masterpiece, got all their draws, had the floodgates, at that point you lost the game. And that was a scary thing. Having one Masterpiece was scary. So, I don't care what anyone says. Monarchs, yes, they had a tier 0. They had an FTK. They controlled the game. They were not as scary as True Draco. I was able to run over Monarchs with ease. But if I saw a True Draco player, that scared me. So that's why I think it's one of the better decks of this format. One of the best decks of this format. So yeah. Next, Zodiac. I believe True Draco came out after Zodiac, so I realized this list is slightly wrong, but I don't have time to remake the video, so we're going with it. But yeah, Zodiac. Zodiac is one of the best decks of all time. Being a deck that seems to have been a basis for the Link mechanic, being that you can literally just summon one Zodiac monster and go up into like 5 different Xyz monsters. This deck is one of the best decks of the decade, if not one of the best decks of all of Yu-Gi-Oh! Being a control-based deck that had multiple different formats, be it its first format, where it had Zodiac Barrage, Rat Peer, where you could literally just summon multiple Rat Peers, make multiple Xyz monsters, be it when you had the Norden build, where you could literally fusion substitute into Norden, summon more monsters, go into more Xyz players, with triple Dagos to Emerald, infinitely recycling your resources, be it any of the Zodiac formats, this deck was not fun. This deck was absolute hell. This deck was a deck that was not fun to play against. And honestly, it's definitely one of the best decks of all time. Being that it's a deck that just could constantly link up, Xyz up. Being a deck that was one monster, consistency everywhere. Broad Ball, Trident pops on your opponent's turn. Broad Ball searches any Zodiac monster, such as Whiptail, to make your Zodiacs bigger. Being able to just kill your opponent with ease. Being able to control the game with Solemn Strikes, enemy controllers. This deck was potentially one of the worst designed decks Konami ever made, but it was one of the best decks that they ever made. It was a deck that single-handedly won so many events that it just did. It really just did. It was something that has always been here and will always seem to be here, but will never be good again, because Konami have taken away all of its power. Being that Trident and Broad Ball, if they ever came back, if both of them came back, this deck would see play again, and this deck would be good again. But with just one of them, such as Trident coming back, the deck is fine. Broad Ball, that can't come back. But this is a deck that was infinitely powerful in its era, and it still can instill fear into people if played right. So, Zodiac, you were a scary deck. Rat Peer, you can stay out 1. Trident, you can come back. Broad Ball, stay on the ban list. But yeah, this deck, definitely something to be scared of as well. Next though, this is a card. It's not a deck, it's a card, but it made every one of these decks, and that is That Grass Looks Greener. Any 60 card grass deck was insane. You had to play 60 card decks yourself to stop the 60 card deck from being good. And that defined an entire meta. That defined an entire format. Where if you weren't playing a 60 card deck, you lost, because then your opponent mills 20 cards and has everything. And there were so many different versions. There was the Light Swarm version that used Minerva and used multiple different cards like Minerva to mill more cards, get more advantage, set up a board and kill your opponent or negate your opponent. There was the Infernoid build. Yes, the Infernoid build that literally just looked at your opponent, said, oh, I'm playing Infernoid, so I'm just going to mill out my deck, summon all these Infernoids, nuke your board, and then go for game. And there was even a cheeky Skull Servant build that a friend of mine played, our regional, came second in Zodiac format, full power Zodiac format, and didn't care. This deck, this card, made 60 card decks one of the most relevant things in the game. And this card, if it ever came back, would bring 60 card decks back. Like, the only reason this card was banned was because it made the game take longer. And that is something that in itself can say is one of the best things in the game of the decade. Like, literally, Grass Looks Greener, 60 card decks were insane, and that's why it's on this list. So, That Grass Looks Greener decks, and it even carried into Link format, where it was still insane with Curious and other cards like that. So, no reason not for it to be here. Next, Spiral. I remember when Spiral was garbage, and that was fine, but then they got Spiral Double Helix, and instantly the deck became tier 0. This deck was literally everywhere. It killed all the competition. It was able to make extra link boards that just looked at your opponent and been like, hey, I've got an extra link now, so how are you beating me? I've got a sleeper as well that's going to pop 2 of your cards. You can't really touch me. This deck was insane in this decade, in its time. Its tier 0 version was crazy. Its extra link version was crazy. It's literally sleeper plus Last Resort was crazy. And that's insane how a deck like Spiral were able to literally just say, hey, so I'm going to extra link you. You're going to be unable to play the game. I'm going to know your next 3 draws because if Drones says I can look at the top 3 cards of your deck. I'm going to stop you from being able to stop me by making a Tri-Gate Wizard that will say negate. I'm going to make a sleeper that's going to pop 2 of your cards. And my extra link is basically going to be untouchable with a Cerberus, Phoenix, and a Nightmare Goblin. This deck was insane. Quick Fix gave you more consistency. Drones gave you ability to control your opponent's deck. Double Helix gave you the ability to draw. Master Plan was able to search the field spell, giving you more consistency. Like, there was nothing bad about Spiral in this format. And the deck's even coming back in the new decade as well, with the Dark Magician support that even makes it even more powerful. So, yeah. Spiral are definitely one of the decks in this decade that I think are one of the best decks. And this is just, I can't not say it. So, Spiral's one of them. And the last deck on this list that I personally think is one of the best decks of the decade, and definitely should be here, is Sky Strikers. I hate Sky Strikers. I own the deck because I thought, I'll pick it up, it's here, it's gonna be good. But ever since this deck was released in its original set, the deck has been a problem. The deck has been constantly used through the last 1.5 years, to constantly gain resources as an engine, as a pure deck, as a control deck. Taken multiple YCSs on its own, taken YCSs when it didn't even think it could be taken YCS, taken regionals, taken big events everywhere. This deck in this decade is one of the most consistent, most control-based decks in the game, and I don't think I couldn't put it on this list. Like, there were so many other decks that I could put on this list. Like, the Danger FDK that played Cannon Soldier and Firewall. The Lunalight deck, Orcust. There are so many decks that I could put on this list over Sky Strikers. But I can't. Because Sky Striker is literally one of the best decks released in the game. Because it just literally says, no matter what you do to me, you limit my Kagari, you limit my multi-roll, you limit my drones, you limit my Widowmaker. I'm still gonna play the game, I'm still gonna ignore you, I'm still gonna exist in so many decks and take out so many decks as well, and I'm just not going to care. That's what Sky Striker is. It's one of the best decks ever created in the game. It's the best control deck in my... I hate to say it, I love Autoguys thinking it's better than Sky Striker, and it can kill Striker easily, but it's literally the best control deck in the game right now. It's been able to take so many events, it's just not dying, it kills every best deck easily, except for maybe True Draco. It's a deck that just says, I'm gonna be here. And that's my faults. Like, these are the best decks in the decade, in my personal opinion. Like, there are so many other decks that could have been on this list. Blackwings were really good in this decade. Heroes, definitely something that came on and off in this decade. Fire Fists, when they were released. Spellbooks is another thing. But the decks, these are, in my personal opinion, the best decks. Like, FTKs have been all around the place. Like, Pendulum FTK, Danger FTK, Gemini FTK. There have been so many different versions of it, but these, in my personal opinions, are the best decks. Like, hell, even decks like Hat. If I put Hat on this list, that would be another deck. But in my personal opinion, these 10 decks are the best 10 decks of the decade, and that's just my thoughts and opinions. But guys, tell me what you think are the best decks of the decade in your personal opinion in the comment section below. I'd love to hear your thoughts and opinions. As I said at the beginning of this video, Happy New Year to all of you. It's been great. It's been a great decade. I've gotten better at the game, topping multiple UK nationals, topping regionals. Hopefully I'm going Euros in the new decade, so look forward to that. And I've just grown the channel and I'm getting bigger and bigger, so hopefully you look forward to the new content, hoping to increase the content as well. I try my best, but obviously my life, I'm going gym now. So many changes in this decade. I've finished school, I've got a proper job, I'm going to the gym. I'm just I'm getting my life on track, and yeah, still living in my room with my brother. Can't change that though. But guys, thank you so much for a great decade. Hopefully we'll reach 1,000 in the new decade. And yeah, best decade of Yu-Gi-Oh! For me, personally, even though the last year wasn't that great. But yeah, guys, Robbat1, signing out. Have a happy new year, and I will see you in the new decade. Later all.